your organization uses a mix of contractors, volunteers, and employees, you want to make sure that you understand the distinction between all three so that you can avoid miscategorizing and creating a legal or financial nightmare for your organization. So if you use any one of those types of workers or a mix of all three, you'll want to keep watching. Let's jump in. So first up, let's discuss volunteers. Typically, volunteers are drawn to organizations due to the mission or the cause. They really want to support the organization. And then on the organization side, a lot of times volunteers are needed to get the work done. So it ends up being a win-win for the organization and for the person volunteering. Where sometimes we get into sticky situations is when volunteers start to teeter into that employee realm. And so we want to just walk through what you need to know and understand about working with volunteers for your organization to make sure that that doesn't happen. Now, one of the things that you want to think about is what is your organization's aim or goal for using volunteers? One of the things that I caution organizations against is just randomly, putting out a call for volunteers, bringing them into the organization to do work without really having some sort of strategy or plan for how these people will be used, where they will be placed, and how you will even determine, is this even working for us, right? Are we actually achieving what we set out to do? So once you think through that, you want to start there. So with that goal, with that aim, and then work backwards. Another thing you want to think about, and this is something I heavily caution organizations against, is just randomly placing volunteers in different areas. Something that I've been seeing consistently on LinkedIn lately are calls for volunteers for certain important positions in the organization, like someone to assist you with your bookkeeping or your accounting, or someone to assist you in the operations or with fundraising. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but what you want to make sure of is if you are using a volunteer in an area that is very specific, right? And it is very important to the organization that that person actually has some experience in that, right? So you don't just want someone who is raising their hand and saying, I want to help, put me anywhere, right? That's great, but you also want to make sure that you don't create a mess for the organization. Thinking with the example of the bookkeeper, if you're using a volunteer bookkeeper, the person at least needs to have bookkeeping experience. Place these volunteers in areas that are their zone of genius. So although they're volunteers, they're actually supporting and helping in an area that they have experience with. And so it really ends up being a benefit to the organization. Finally, with volunteers, you want to make sure that you understand your state's rules and regulations of using them, right? So each state is going to be a bit different, but you want to make sure that you understand the implications of using volunteers in your organization, in your state, so that you don't accidentally treat them like an employee and then create some issues in your organization. There are a number of factors that determine whether or not you're teetering off from volunteer into employee land. Now, I jotted these down, so you'll see me veer off a little bit because I wanted to make sure that I did not mess these up. I want to make sure that you get these. So first, is the activity less than a full-time occupation? Is the person just contributing, a couple of hours here and there? You want to make sure they aren't working 40 hours and getting lunch breaks, because if someone were to come in, that definitely sounds like an employee, right? When you think volunteer, it's someone that's maybe giving up their free time, a couple of hours here and there, nothing that is significant. So that's the first point. The second point is, are these services, whatever the volunteer is offering, right, being offered without pressure or coercion, right? We want to make sure that there's no issues around there, that there isn't this notion of they have to work for the organization or they have to support and help the organization, because that will raise a red flag. The third, are the services, the support that the volunteer is giving the organization, is this something that usually falls in the realm of volunteer work, right? So, you want to make sure that you aren't asking them to do things that are out of the ordinary, because that could raise a red flag to determine, is something else going on here, right? But if it's a food pantry and you're asking volunteers to come in and help you, serve food to the homeless, give out canned goods, that's something that's consistent with volunteer work. So you want to make sure that that lines up. And then lastly, does the volunteer expect to receive any benefit from working with the organization or from volunteering with the organization? Now, we know when an employee works, they expect to be paid. Is this volunteer supporting and giving of their time expecting something in return? You want to make sure that that's not the case, because if it is, then that is a little bit of a red flag, and that starts to signal that this person is not truly a volunteer. That sums up what we want to discuss about volunteers. I want to now move into the contractor realm and talk about that distinction of contractor and employees, because this really gets people tripped up. So let's move on to contractors. Now, listen closely. I know that there are rumblings and little, secrets about how using contractors is an easier play because it's cheaper. But let me tell you, if the IRS, the government, ever finds out that you are using contractors when really these individuals, these people are employees, it opens up a can of worms. You may owe back pay, you may owe taxes, penalties. You don't want to do that. So you want to be very careful for mislabeling someone who's actually an employee to a contractor. So now that I put that disclaimer out there, let's get into it. Now, typically a contractor is usually hired to complete a certain scope of work, usually very limited scope of work. Most times they are hired for a project, right? To really complete something that has a start and an end date. Whereas if you think of an employee, they're usually hired for a long-term play. The hope is that the employee will be with the organization, right, for the foreseeable future. That's not the case with a contractor. Contractors also have the ability to set their own rates. They set their own hours. They negotiate the contract, right, with the organization, and they're able to complete said project or scope of work with little to no input from the organization. And now when I say little to no input, I mean as to how, right, to do it, because the idea is that you're hiring someone with the skill set to complete said project, and so you're not dictating to them how this should be done. Let's go through an example. So a couple of years ago, I was hired as a contractor for an organization here in New York who wanted to migrate from desktop accounting software to cloud accounting software. Very definitive. I was moving them from one software to the next, and after I moved them from one software to the next, the job was done. How I were to move them from one software to the next was determined by me. The rate was determined by me. The hours that I worked was determined by me. What the organization did set was the deadline, right? So they hired me with this limited scope of work, right, which was to move them from one software to the next with a deadline of X date. That's an example of a contractor versus if you had an employee who was working in your organization, they've been there, let's say for a couple of years, and you determined that internally that you guys were going to take on the task of moving from one software to the next. You could say to your controller, hey, this is what we're going to be doing. You could dictate how they did it. You could determine their hours. You're already paying them. Like, that's very different versus going out and bringing someone in to complete this very direct, exact thing. That's the specifics around contractors. Very straightforward. Now let's walk into figuring out, when you should be classifying someone as an employee, because this is where things get tricky. People want to avoid paying taxes and, benefits, health insurance and things like that. And you want to be very mindful of that because the government will come after you if they find out that you are miscategorizing your worker. So neither here nor there, let's get into it. Employees are an organization's paid staff. It is a paid staff member. Typically, they are brought on with the idea that they will be with the organization for the foreseeable future. There typically is no end date, right, unless they got fired, but usually don't come into the relationship with an end date in mind. They are going to be working for the organization. So now I'm going to give another example. So let's say you hire a controller for your organization. You set the hours, you set the rate, right? You typically set the parameters which they work in. So you might have policies and procedures that they are operating within. People are reporting to them, right? You might have funders and board and any other external users who, reach out to said controller, but all of the things that they're doing are dictated by the organization. That's the key thing to point out, that the organization determines how things get done and the parameters in which that person can operate in. Some specifics. I'm gonna go back to my bullet points. First things first, the organization controls what the worker does and does not do. They determine how the worker does the job and what the things that they don't want the worker to do, right, as it relates to the job. Second, the organization also controls the financial and business aspects of the job, right? That does not lie in the hands of the employee. And lastly, Are things like how the worker is paid, the type of benefits that they get, reimbursed expenses, providing tools and supplies, are these things controlled by the organization? If they are, then that person 9 times out of 10 is an employee and needs to be labeled and treated as such. Now here is a quote that I got from the IRS website that I want to read and reiterate to you. If you classify an employee as an independent contractor and you have no reasonable basis for doing so, you may be liable for employment taxes and back wages for that worker. Now, working in an organization, you don't want to be responsible for paying penalties and, back wages and taxes because you chose to go the cheap route, right? You wanted to evade doing the right thing. Now, I know that sometimes that doesn't come from a malicious place. I know that sometimes organizations are trying to figure out how can we cut costs? What are some hacks, right, to getting what we need but paying less for it? But honestly, it comes back to bite you. So don't even do it. Now, I hope that this was helpful. Now, remember, you have volunteers, you have contractors, you have employees. There's nothing wrong with using a mix of the three. You just have to make sure that they are not doing something that they are not legally able to do. So you want to make sure that you are labeling them correctly and keeping them in the correct buckets. Now, if you have any questions or any specifics about any one of the types of workers, leave them in the comments below. Any other questions you have, you can also leave those, and I'll see you guys in the next video.